Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Joe Navaro in Tampa, Florida. Joe is an international best-selling author and body language expert. He spent 25 years at the FBI working as both an agent and a supervisor in the areas of counterintelligence and counterterrorism. Through his work, he was able to study, refine, and apply the science of nonverbal communications. Joe is the author of numerous books and articles on body language, including What Every Body is Saying, an ex-FBI agent's guide to speed reading people. Joe, thank you for joining me today.
Angela, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Gosh, I am so excited to talk with you. This is one of my very favorite topics, and you are such an expert in this field. I really have to kick it off with my very first, most basic question, which is what got you so interested in body language?
Well, as you know, I came to this country as a refugee, and I didn't speak English, and so I had to rely on the one universal language that even at a young age of 8 seemed to I could rely on, and that was body language. And I found it to just be fascinating to just study people. Now, obviously, my parents were so busy working; they were both working 3 jobs that they didn't have time for that. But I had much more free time, and I just started to just study people and watch people, and later in life, when my playmates were collecting baseball cards, I was collecting 3x5 cards of little weird behaviors that people did, and that's really what got me started.
Wow! When you say you had 3x5 cards of behaviors, were you were taking notes and you were like observing people at a young age? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because I had read books about Thomas Edison and about Leonardo da Vinci at school, and they always said these guys always take notes throughout the day of the things they observed. And I thought, well, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. And by the way, the other tip was that these guys like to take a nap a lot, and so do I.
Oh, that's funny. That's great. Well, so, you mentioned, and we talked about this briefly before we got started, but nonverbal communication. So it sounds like it's more than just what we think of as body language. Like, what is included in nonverbal communication? Like, it seems like it's a broader scope.
Angela, that's a great question, and you're exactly right. Nonverbal communication is anything that communicates a thought, a feeling, a sentiment, but is not a word. So the color of a room, the color of a couch, the clothing that you wear, why is it that politicians are always framed in front of the color blue, or the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are always framed in the color blue? Because these colors, the clothing, all of these things communicate. That's within the umbrella of nonverbals. It just so happens that body language is within one sliver of that and is a very narrow area of nonverbals, because nonverbals also includes how we touch things, how things feel, like how your smartphone feels in your hand and where you touch, and or a business card. That's all considered nonverbals.
That's so interesting and such a good observation. I don't want to go down a totally a rabbit hole, but I will say in my own career, I was almost always the only woman who ever worked in any area where I worked. And I thought about color and those kinds of nonverbal cues a lot when I would go for job interviews, because I was trying not to be sort of put into the wrong bucket, so to speak. And I don't mean to sound strange, but I think it does really come into play in a way that you don't really think about consciously.
Oh, I think you're right, and it has nothing to do with the fact that you were a woman in that sector. It's the recognition that we are affected by colors. Children who are on the spectrum disorder, if there's any yellow color around, it really it puts them on hyper alert. It's very discomforting. The color red affects us emotionally, and it can't be overused. While the color of blue, especially the blues that mimic the sky or the color of the water in the, let's say, the Virgin Islands, our brain favors that.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have interestingly, if you have a website and it has these colors of blue in it, people are going to click on it more, and they're going to stay on the site longer than if it was any other color.
Mm-hmm.
So it's communicating something to us. It's just doing it at a subconscious level, which creates, and this is the most important thing in business, psychological comfort.
Mm.
Not perfection, psychological comfort, because psychological comfort is what guarantees that people will return and that you increase face time with somebody else. And so that's why things like this are important.
I totally agree. And I also think what you're kind of hitting on there is so often results in business are not always about who is the most qualified person in the room. It's sometimes the person that you're the most comfortable with or the person that you want to do business with, even more than qualifications.
Oh, absolutely. Since I retired from the Bureau, which now is about 15 years, and I've been on the road teaching. I just came out with my 13th book in April on espionage called 3 Minutes to Doomsday, and in doing research for that, in consulting all over the world, one of the things that I have learned is that when you go to an organization, you can ask two questions. Number one, do you have someone here who's really obnoxious and nobody likes? And everybody says, yeah, there is one. And then there is, do you have someone that's really stellar, and why are they? And they'll tell you because they're people persons.
Mm-hmm.
And this sort of binary bifurcation, and everybody else is somewhere in between, seems to be true, where invariably you run into an organization and it's the person that is really good with people,
mm-hmm.
that makes for the best salesperson and makes for the best sort of connector between groups, and that's invaluable to an organization.
Yeah, I totally agree. Absolutely. Well, so as it applies specifically to body language,
Mm-hmm.
In your book, what everybody is saying,
Yeah.
you broke it down into different sort of parts. Like I noticed, it's like feet and legs, torso, hips, chest
Yeah.
and shoulders, arms, hands and fingers, face. Like I'm curious, as you kind of break it apart, are there certain areas of the body that are more or less important as we're communicating?
Well, again, you always, Angela, you ask profound questions. The reason that I broke it down that way, where I started with the feet, was that most of the books that are written about body language start with the face.
Mm.
And I decided to start with the feet because the feet are actually the most honest part of our bodies. Because our feet assist us with survival, we move away from threats. When we hear a loud noise, it's the feet that hold us in place, and so forth. And so I started with the feet because, number one, it's the one area that we often forget, and yet look how often when somebody walks into the room that we don't like, we will look at them and make facial contact for social reasons, but our feet are already turning away.
Right.
That is so accurate. It's it's so singularly accurate that lets us know, okay, there's some sort of issue here. These people don't like each other. Why? Because our feet will orient towards the people we like and away from those we don't. And we see that certainly in juries where an attorney is on the stand either doing cross-examination or doing closing argument. And boy, oh boy, if the feet of the jury are turned towards the jury room, good luck, because they've already turned this person off. So the feet are very accurate, and what I try to teach is you can't ignore the whole body. You can't ignore the hands that are rubbing against the side of the leg as a person is sitting getting ready to speak, because that tells you this person has some issue. Maybe they're not prepared, maybe they're coming up with some bad news, or maybe they're just nervous, but the body's speaking to you. And then, of course, the face, where we tend to spend a lot of time picking up on visual cues from the face, but we have to be careful because we can fake a smile, we can fake interest and so forth if we're not careful, and so that's why I wrote it that way, just as a reminder that we must never forget the rest of the body.
Wow, that's so interesting. The thing with the feet, I had not really thought about that before, and I guess we also, when we're thinking of, hey, I need to look like I like this person, we're typically thinking, like you said, of the smile, and the feet are not something we're necessarily consciously controlling.
Exactly. The feet will turn away. And, I mean, they're extremely accurate. Before you even say to somebody, hey, Jim, I got to go, I will assure you that your lead foot, for most of us, it's the right, will already be orienting towards the exit, even before you declare it. And of course, how wonderful when you can pick up on these tells and say to the person, do you need to go? Oh, yeah, sorry, I have to go. They'll want to come back and spend time with you, because the worst thing is they're giving off these cues, you're not picking up on them, and now you have to go and look at your own watch or even say, hey, I got to go. I can assure you that we tend not to reward individuals that waste our time.
Absolutely. And also, when it comes to this smile, do you also focus around like the eyes, like in terms of, I often hear that people's eyes are different when they're genuinely smiling versus when they're not.
Yeah, that's a good question, Angela. There's a lot that's been written about a true smile, social smile, and so forth. What I look for is, and I see people smiling on the street. I see people smiling on the elevator. And, you just don't have time to sit there and say, was that what we call a Duchenne smile, where it engages the corner of the mouth and the eyes? I don't have time for that. What I look for is, do they look contented? Do they look like they're happy to see me? Is there a sort of shine in their eyes? But more importantly than perhaps the eyes is, do I see any kind of head tilt? Because we only tilt our head slightly to the side when we like the person in front of us. Think of courtship behaviors where during dating, you're sitting at a cafe and your head is tilted, exposing your neck, and the other party is doing the same thing. This is one of the most endearing things that we can do that show that we like this person and that we care, that we don't have an agenda, that we're listening. And so I look more for those kinds of things. And by the way, even more powerful than the smile is the canting of the head, because that actually increases the amount of time that somebody will spend with you, even more than a smile.
Oh, that's so interesting. Very interesting.
If you notice with babies, as early as 3 to 4 weeks, when you approach a baby and you tilt your head, they react with a happier face, and with humans, with adults, it's the same thing. We like people that when they don't look like a drill sergeant,
right?
Literally what we used to call stiff-necked, rigid.
That makes a lot of sense.
So one of the things, if you're applying for a job, one of the things that you can do to endear yourself to whoever's doing the interview is, obviously you come in and you smile, and you may be nervous, but just a slight head tilt says, at a subconscious level, I'm receptive. My mind is plastic. I'm willing to learn. And those are powerful cues to transmit.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Our listeners today are all job seekers. And so that tip is going to really, I know, resonate with them. I know just in my own background, I have a probably like what you could call like an addiction to job interviewing. And when I was younger, I interviewed continuously, like other people probably gamble or something. And I was able to kind of talk my way into or get job offers for a lot of jobs that maybe I didn't have the qualifications for. And I suspect it had some to do with the things that you're describing, getting people to be comfortable and showing people that I was open to learning. But for those of us who are still out there interviewing for jobs, what other things should we keep in mind? Because there's so much going on when you're interviewing for a job. What should we really be focusing on with regards to our body language?
Well, that's another good question. And because I've liaised with so many really great organizations, and usually the folks from their HR departments are always there. One of the things that we have to remember is that Shakespeare was right. Life is a little bit like theater, and one of the things I find that people don't do is they don't rehearse for an interview. And in the FBI, I remember having rehearsals for an interview over and over, and you think, well, you got 15 years in the bureau, you shouldn't need to rehearse it. And we rehearsed it because they're important. Mm-hmm. And what I mean rehearsal is you're going to dress exactly as you're going to come in that day, and you're going to look at yourself and say, can I change anything here? Is this we've all seen it. Is this jacket too long? I've never tied a tie. Maybe you've never had a job where you needed a tie. Now you're going from maybe, let's say, a blue-collar job to a white-collar job. Do I know how to tie a tie properly? And so forth. And so you get that out of the way so that you feel comfortable with that. But the other one I say is put that, smartphone in front of you and record yourself and record 2 minutes of what you say and what you sound like, and ask yourself, do I like it? Mm-hmm. Does it sound right? Am I hesitating with the questions? Am I not making eye contact? Do I have a habit of picking at my fingers as I'm talking? Use that opportunity to correct yourself in the same way that actors prepare themselves, because getting a job is important. Obviously going in with enthusiasm is great, but so is being prepared with the right answers about what you propose to bring to your employer, and your eagerness to learn and so forth. And so from a nonverbal perspective, do your homework. How do people work there? What do they? When they come to work, how do they dress? I was invited to Sony Studios 2 years ago, and I showed up there, and I was the only guy on the property with a suit and tie on. And most of my clients are in New York, and that's what's expected. Out in California, it was jeans and a a nice long sleeve shirt. So you've got to know where you're headed, and you also have to be aware of what is expected, because they want you to fit in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good way to put it. So simply, they want you to fit in. I mean, in one instance, the thing that comes to mind, you mentioned going from a blue-collar job to a white-collar job.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes, especially, I know I came from humble beginnings myself, and as you're moving into a different sort of socioeconomic status, it seems like there are some things that you have to be aware of in order to make that transition a little bit more smooth. I mean, would you agree with that? And if so, are there certain things that you pay attention to, when someone is moving between classes?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Angela, and I think because of your experience, you're sensitive to it. No matter what sector you go in. I mean, I remember when I went from college life to FBI agent, and that was quite a transition. I was only 23 years old, very young, certainly ignorant of many things, but naive in other things. And, I had to pay attention to the others and tell myself, buddy, you're going to have to take a back seat for a while until you learn everything. And I think a mistake a lot of people make is they'll say, well, I'm going to be true to myself and I'm going to do this and do that, when actually, the first 6 months to a year, they really ought to be paying attention to, when should we speak? When should we speak up? How should we communicate? How do we handle issues in this organization? Things like that. How do they dress? I'll tell you a funny story. About the first time I got to the Phoenix division. This is right after Saturday Night Fever, and everybody at the stores was selling these white suits.
Oh wow!
Okay. All right. I raised my hand. I actually bought one of those things because it was on sale, because I didn't have a lot of money. I was, it was my first year in the bureau. Well, obviously, I didn't fit the part of an FBI agent, I quickly got rid of that. But what it reminded me of is you have to be aware of where you are. What is the culture of your organization? The other thing you have to be aware of is what job am I seeking? Because certain jobs require certain attire, certain haircuts, certain demeanor, and we have to sometimes abide. So we have to be observers of where we're going so we can get there.
That's really good advice. And, I think I've heard it described as sort of unspoken rules before and things, these things. And I think they do really have an impact on whether or not you kind of fit in and whether or not people will accept you. And I bring it up only because I think it's something good to be aware of. In my case, I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, and then I went to college in New York and in upstate New York, and I went to grad school in Malibu, California. And so the social differences and being accepted into those various groups are incredibly different. And I think even when you pay attention to the cues, you can still be an outsider to some degree, because it's so different, and the differences are in such tiny detail sometimes. That it's tough. So I think it's definitely something to pay attention to.
Yeah, but that again, Angela, speaks to, in your case, you're a very good observer, and it's the fact that you're paying attention, to these things. You may not always get them right. I never got everything right. but you're paying attention to it. And I think that's what contributes to social intelligence. Yeah, at the same time, you may have someone that is transitioning, as I do here in the Tampa area, because I live 4 miles from CENTCOM, is military folks who are leaving the service and now are going into the private sector. And these people make great employees. They're very loyal and so forth. But they don't realize that they do things like answer Roger that or 10-4 or something like that at their first job, or that they show up with a military G-Shock watch, which is very helpful when grenades are going off. They still keep time, but they're not really necessary when you're now wearing a French cuff shirt. So you have to sort of assess yourself and say, what do I do to fit in? And a lot of organizations have, as you say, an unwritten code as to attire. The financial sector certainly has one. Medicine has one. Insurance, I can assure you, has a sort of unwritten code. The hotel industry, some of their codes are actually, written about, you will not have too much jewelry on your ear. You will not have any exposed tattoos and so forth. And so we have to be aware of those things.
I think that's a great point, especially about the industries. I mean, and not to overshare about myself today, but I started in engineering. So my very first job, I worked in a manufacturing plant for the Chevy Malibu for General Motors. And my very last job, I was a vice president at a bank. And I used to say that I had costumes that I would wear to work because, when you work at a manufacturing facility, you wear steel-toed boots and khaki pants, and you wear a golf shirt. And when you work at a bank, you wear a suit and you wear pantyhose, and high-heeled shoes. And so it's a really different outfit, and I think you have to be aware of it. And, I know in my closet, I have different sections for these different times in my life, and they are literally like they were worn by different people. So I completely agree with you. Anyway, beyond that, though, one thing I'm really curious about is voice, because sometimes we may say something and maybe our voice is strong and we sound confident, but our body language, maybe our back is kind of hunched over and we're looking at the ground. And I'm curious, when we have that sort of conflicting body language and voice situation, which one is the hiring manager paying attention to? Like, which one do they believe?
Well, let me say this about voice, because with this I'm very familiar. There's voice, and then there are the behaviors that go along with the voice. The biggest thing that we're seeing with voice is the research that's been done on what's called uptalk. And uptalk is, and we see this more with females, young females, but we're also seeing it now with a lot of young men. And that's where you end a sentence not affirmatively, but it ends up sounding like it's a question. So it sounds something like this: whatever, whoever. Don't, it's on an up. And your listeners can Google this on all the research. It's now to the point where as soon as someone hears uptalk, they're already scoring you negatively with one word, just with one word. So I would caution you that your voice should be modulated so that it sounds confident, not equivocating. And uptalk definitely does that. And I don't know if it's proper to to still use a term where you don't want to sound like a valley girl, or the Kardashians are notorious for sounding like this. But now there's so much research that it really hurts very well educated, very well prepared women, but it makes them sound like they're unsure and equivocating. What I would tell you also is that the assumption is that we have to raise our voice to emphasize, when I try to teach that if something is really important, that what you need to do is actually lower your voice. The human mind, when it hears a lower voice, tends to pay more attention. If you think about courtship behavior, and if you think about those times when our mothers or parents were trying to get us to go to sleep and so forth, there's something about the brain. It just reacts to that lower voice, and so that's something that should be rehearsed, so that you get used to saying something like, and finally, I would just like to say that, I'm going to work hard for your company. And you say that with a lower voice, not with a higher voice. As far as your nonverbals with your body language, I would say that that your hands should always be visible, that you should sit up, not slouch in any way, that the human brain seeks to see the hands. And if you look at the TED Talks, the reason they're so popular, obviously content, but you notice that nobody hides behind a podium, and they always gesticulate with their hands. That's very powerful. And make sure that when you gesture, that you gesture smoothly but broadly. People that are insecure gesture frantically but narrowly, and you never want to do that.
That makes a lot of sense. Wow, that's interesting. And it sounds like, with regards to the voice, that you were saying that the minute that we start sort of doing this uptalk thing, the Valley Girl sound, it sounds like the hiring managers, like we're out at that point. I mean, they're switching us off.
Exactly, Angela. The research is very ample. I don't have it in front of me, but there's been so many studies on that immediately they're turning you off. They're already saying, there's something about this person that they're equivocating. They just don't sound confident. One of the things that the military teaches, and it teaches especially women coming on board very well, is they tell them, go out and find your command voice. And I certainly learned it as an FBI agent, to have a command voice. I mean, why should somebody say, stop, if I say stop? And this is something that we have. It's a skill. It's a skill like any other skill, and you should have a command voice so that when you say the word no, there is no equivocation. When you say no, it's a complete sentence, and it's an order. It's not an idea, and there's a big difference. But these are things that we can work on and say, do I have to work on my voice and how we speak? I mean, I am in no way now speaking and gesticulating in the same way that I was when I was 23. I had to learn these things, but I wish I had someone say to me, you need to work on these things. I would have worked on them much earlier, and I think I would have benefited from them much earlier.
Well, it's really interesting, and I'm glad that you mentioned the fact that it is a skill and something that you can improve upon, because that's really helpful and, kind of gives us hope that we can improve as we go. So in terms of our body language, I was curious, one last question about our body language, which is there any advice out there that you think maybe we should ignore? Like, are there any myths about body language that are wrong?
Yeah, a lot of them, and I'm glad you asked that. The biggest myth I see is that people say, don't cross your arms across your belly, that puts people off. That's just, the clinical term for that is crap. The fact is that, when we're sitting down and we're comfortable, we're watching a movie, waiting for somebody, this is very comforting. I did a very unscientific study. In the last 2 flights that I had, I got bumped into first class because I had a lot of mileage, so I was happy for that. And as I'm sitting there and I'm watching all the women that would queue up to the bathroom, I noticed that in excess of 95% of them, as soon as they got to outside the bathroom and were waiting, they all crossed their arms across their belly. This is a self-comforting behavior, and that's all there is, and we shouldn't look at it as anything but that. The other thing that I find, which is a great myth, is that if you touch your face or look away while you're talking, that the person is lying. That's just nonsense. And the other one, that if you look in one direction 1 second and then in another when you answer, that you're being deceptive. There's been 23 studies that show that there is no science to support that. So, in part, I wrote what everybody is saying to get rid of the myths, because there were so many myths. When I started in the FBI, I just couldn't believe some of the myths that were out there about, if they cover their mouth or touch their nose, definitely they're lying. That's just nonsense.
Oh, those are excellent tips. Well, so I want to also think of it from sort of the other perspective. So we're in the job interview, and it seems like it's going well. But are there any tips that you have for us that we could say, look at the hiring manager and tell whether or not that hiring manager is interested in us, like whether or not that hiring manager thinks that we're doing well in the interview?
Yeah, another great question, and I'm glad you asked that. The first thing I look for is, do I begin to see what are called gravity-defying behaviors? They've gone from being stoic and welcoming you, and now, as they talk to you, they become more emphatic by flashing the eyebrows, arching the eyebrows. Do they reach further towards you with their hands, or are they still sitting near the edge of the desk? Do we see more dramatic displays of the hand as they answer questions? And lastly, do I see more head tilt? Head tilt, once again, is one of the best indicators that they want to spend more time with you. They're very receptive to you. And of course, the opposite is when they go from head tilt, and then maybe you say something really ignorant or not very much appreciated, and that neck becomes rigid. You know that you stepped on it, and there's an issue. But those are the clues, that I always ask for. And I would tell anybody applying for a job, and say, if I may, if there's any notes that you could give me to improve myself, I assure you I would appreciate it. And I'm always surprised at how willing people are to say, well, you dress very well, or try to be on time, or they give positive notes. So never hesitate, especially for young people starting out, or if you're really changing dramatically from one sector of the economy to the other.
Those are all really great tips. I've actually heard also, and I'm wondering if this is true or if this is not true. I've heard sometimes when it's going well that the hiring manager will sometimes mirror your body language back. Like if you have your hands in a certain position, they may do that too. Is that true, or is that kind of a myth?
Well, mirroring is just indicative of comfort, that we are comfortable. I don't disagree with that. The problem with mirroring in an interview process is it's kind of stilted, because most of the time you're sitting in a chair and you may or may not be able to put your hands on the desk, and the other person is on the other side, and it's sort of rigid. Anytime you're mirrored and things are good, then this is considered harmony. But more powerfully, I would look for behaviors where there is more reaching out to you, there is more dramatic hand gestures, there's more head tilt, and especially if they touch you on the arm. That's actually very positive.
I've had people touch me on the hand before, which made me uncomfortable.
I didn't. Yeah, I don't like that either. I had a CEO drive me from the airport, and he thought it was okay to touch the knee of a 65-year-old man, and I just kind of looked at him like, no, I don't even let my mother do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some people are just very kind, but they're just not aware of, to get attention. But it's within social norms to, maybe touch the forearm, and an increase in that is usually indicative of sentiment. Remember, anytime we touch, it releases a cascade of neurochemicals, including oxytocin, which is what binds us to babies and each other. So
true.
There's a lot to be said for touch.
True. Well, I will say, so on a similar note, I talk to a lot of people who come to me, and the reason they're looking for a new job is because they really hate their boss, and they wish they could have figured that out before they took the job. I mean, that's like their biggest regret, is that they had this bad boss. And I'm just wondering if you have any tips for us in terms of, we're at the job interview. Is there any way that we can spot a bad boss? I think you actually write about, one of your books is maybe how to stay away from certain negative personalities. And I'm wondering what tips you might have.
Well, that's a great question. So I wrote Dangerous Personalities because they create a danger for us in the fact that they can affect us psychologically, mentally, physically, as well as financially. Mm-hmm. I think it's very difficult to assess someone for those traits immediately, especially if you're being interviewed for a job by someone else. But it does help through social media to find out what other people are saying about this individual. I think anytime you hear things that this person is very calloused, or he's very arrogant, or he has a short fuse, or stuff like that, you may be looking at a very narcissistic individual, and that doesn't mean they like to look at themselves in the mirror. That means they overvalue themselves and devalue you. And I can assure you, no one that I've ever met that says, oh boy, I really love to work with someone that devalues me. Nobody does. And I think the quicker we identify individuals that devalue us, the better, because it's not like they can take a pill and they'll be fixed. By the time they're 15 or so, their personalities are already fixed, and they can be very difficult. I mean, I remember I was still in college, and we were reading things about Steve Jobs, and over the years I collected articles, and all the hints were there, as Isaacson, who did his biography, wrote. He had a nasty disposition, and even Wozniak, in the end, could not stand working with him. And therein is the problem of somebody who is pathologically narcissistic. They're so valuing themselves, they devalue others. But I think that's very difficult to assess on your own. The book Dangerous Personalities has a checklist, but even then, you have to observe for those things, and that may be difficult for you.
Yeah, I could see that, because you just have that brief moment, and it's hard to really get to know someone in those just few minutes when you're interviewing, or when they're interviewing you, I should say. Well,
but, Angela, before we go, I will tell you this. Gavin DeBecker, in his great book, The Gift of Fear, which I highly recommend, tells you that even in a momentary interview, listen to your gut. Listen to those hairs that stand up. Listen to any caution from your brain that says there's something wrong here, because we are primed. Our DNA is primed through the limbic system to assess for things that could hurt us or are dangerous to us. And oftentimes they speak to us softly, and we must never ignore those feelings or sentiments. And I'm sure in your life you've had instances where something said, "Oh boy, I got to get out of here," and you're the better for it.
Yes, I think that is like the perfect note to end on, because that is the most important thing, is to listen to your gut. Well, so Joe, this has been wonderful. I'd love to know, where can we learn more about you? Where can we get a copy of your book, What Everybody is Saying? Where's the best place to go?
Well, thank you. Well, my website is jnforensic.com, but most people just Google my name, Joe Navaro, and they'll find their way. All of my books are available on Amazon. They're also available with your local book dealers, and I always encourage people, go to your local book dealer and help them along, and all my books can be located there also.
Excellent. Well, Joe, thank you so much. It was so good to chat with you today.
Well, it was my pleasure, and Angela, I really appreciate what you do, and you are a most exceptional interviewer, so thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. Thanks to those of you who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to angela@copelandcoaching.com. You can also send me questions via Twitter. I'm @Copeland Coach, and on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on iTunes and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.